Esther and I thought of this show, it was just in response to, microaggressions that we were seeing in the community, not just like with the comedy space, like, in comedy, you always, especially if you're a marginalized individual, you're always like kind of experiencing people saying stuff that, they're just getting it for cheap laughs. And then they're also workshopping ideas. So it's not necessarily how it's going to turn out, but like it's a space to like really push people's expectations, whether or not that's good. And so we were experiencing a lot of that. And then Esther also had a video go viral where it was just like her taken out of context, early on when the news of this new coronavirus was coming out of China. And
Right.
so, layer on top of that, it was also Lunar New Year. And another layer on top of that, we were celebrating the first New York City Asian Comedy Festival, that whole weekend. And so, there when we pitched it, it was kind of just like, look, I'm tired, I'm sick of this stuff, and like, we as comedians have the skill, we know the people to bring together. I'm a former scientist and I work in the science like communication space, and so I was like, I know who to bring together to really tackle the actual science and misinformation. And so it kind of grew from there. But I don't think, when we pitched it, we were like, what's the right date? Is March going to be too far from now? Uh, and we were pitching this idea on January 31st, right? And so, I knew that, like, also timing wise, the way that the news cycles go, like, is this going to be relevant? Do people actually want to see something? And it turned out we picked the perfect date to
Yeah.
make it happen, because it was like immediately after that, I mean, it's only been a week ago, but immediately after that, it already feels like it's been a million years since it's happened. The
Oh,
reactions have completely changed. People are so much more violent. People are getting hurt all over the world, right? Like, it's not just the US where we know there's already racial tensions that exist. And so, yeah, I think it's also interesting because we were just chatting with another friend who is a science comedian, Kasha Patel. She's a good friend of mine. I mean, we were just chatting with her. I'm just gonna turn on the light because, like, I'm
yeah,
really
yeah.
not at it. And we were just chatting with her about like our like what it took to put together that show, a coronavirus comedy and science show. Uh, and yeah, like we were just saying how, you know we hit sort of the zeitgeist, but also in terms of laughing at something that's like very pressing, we also managed to do it at a time like seconds before it got too real for Americans to maybe laugh about.
Yeah.
um yeah, it's only been a week and like it feels like so much has already changed.
Well, I wanted to ask you about that too, because, on the one hand, I assumed that, and I think maybe wrongfully so, I assumed that when it started hitting other countries and really hitting them hard, and like, so what's going on in Italy right now and everything, I thought, oh, well, I wonder if this burden and the racism that has been, pushed on Asians will decrease, because obviously it's like it's in Italy, like Italians, you can't, it's
Mhm.
not just like focus, because there are a lot of weirdo conspiracies and stuff out
Yeah,
there,
yeah.
and it's like, I wondered if it would decrease, but then we have this news about Ted Cruz
Mhm.
and how he's referring to the coronavirus, and is that racist? What does that mean? And so, what do you think? I mean, what are you seeing? Has it changed? Has it picked up? Has it gotten worse? Like, what's going on?
Um, so
On the
from a science
rational mind.
perspective,
Yes.
this isn't the first time this happens, which is why for me, even though I was doing a comedy show with fellow Asians that same weekend, that like really it was the week when people were just learning about the coronavirus, and then there was like the news about, okay, maybe this like really started out in a marketplace, and then the jokes about Asian food started coming back again. Like, this isn't the first time an emerging disease has been racialized or tied to a marginalized group, right? We know this from the histories of HIV and AIDS. We know this from Ebola coverage. We know this from MERS, from SARS, from Zika, right?
Mhm.
And like these are all like for some reason when it comes to minoritized individuals, it's so much easier to tie the fear. But we don't see this with like measles outbreak again, you know, like
Right.
which is tied to a different kind of demographic. And you know, and sadly enough, whether or not people subscribe to it, anti-vax movements play a huge role, and like that's not tied to a marginalized group, it's tied to an affluent group actually. And
Yeah.
so the way that the public perception and how that like builds on top of existing racial tensions, it's so different and it's so pressing. Over time though, something that I did notice is, and like on the comedy show we had a lot of like white people jokes, right, which
Yeah.
is, it feels like low hanging fruit sometimes, but and you know, like we did have people who left the show feeling offended, right?
Mm.
um but we also had a lot of people in the room who are people of color who laughed so hard and were like, this was amazing. We also had allies who tend to be younger, you know, white folks who understand that they live in this intersection that's like, you know, they want to be better and be better humans and also just learn from people who experience this. And so the reactions are completely different. I think over time, especially this past week, and now that we've had news coverage of our show spread out on social media, I think I'm seeing a lot more of the interracial tensions like
Hmm.
coming up.
Interesting.
And that's
Yeah.
something that I'm aware of because I'm very active in terms of learning more about what it means to be anti-racist, learning more about, you know, how to lift up other groups who are indigenous, Black, persons with disabilities. I mean, that's something that I'm just passionate about.
Yeah.
Um, but that is something that I'm seeing that is a different form of conversation that needs to happen than what was going on for the past month, right? And
Yeah.
that's not even to do with like, that's not even touching on the politics side and how like, you know, people voting like this is the like the coronavirus stuff is directly tied to a lot of the decisions people are going to make about voting.
Oh, for sure.
um
Yeah.
so yeah, there's just like so many layers to discuss and to like explore. But in terms of reactions to our show, that's the newest thing, is like, okay, now we've tackled like the general, like how white supremacy or like, you know, like how that's tied to communicating emerging diseases, but then also how it plays out in terms of marginalizing people who are already marginalized.
Mm.
And then more recently, like inter community interracial tensions have been playing out
So how often are you going to do the show, or how often do you do the show? I mean, what are the plans if
for the
are you
show.
going? Yeah.
Yeah. I am still in discussion with, like, Esther wants to do the show for sure. I think a lot of people who've seen the value in what we're doing see that they're like we could easily do another show. I'm in talks with the venue, but for myself personally, I feel like I have a social responsibility to not be naive about the timing, like where people's minds are at in terms of you know, like the topics that we're covering, you know, like uh, um and also, you know, the more and more folks who are affected on land in our country, in the US, in the different states, the more that that conversation is going to change. And so I if we do another show, I want to be really mindful of that and like craft that
Mhm.
into the experience of the show just as much as I was really mindful of, you know, what kind of message and narrative we were creating, and like as the performers, and also what the audience is going to experience like for that first show. Like there's a reason why we called it Asian Strike Back, right?
Right. Right.
And it's a lot to do with like, as a comedian, me being like, you know, I the model minority thing really sucks, and that's a very real real issue that like our community has to deal with, and it harms a lot of people, even though it perception wise it's the thing that like, oh, there's too many Asians in Harvard, like you're not suffering, like that's, you know,
Right.
like that is so harmful to so many other minorities, not just Asians as well. And so like that was something that I like when we were creating what kind of titles to use, that was in the back of my mind because that was something that we wanted to tackle. um Later on, I don't know what that's going to look like. Maybe the next version really explores other, you know, emerging diseases and why racism is tied to minorities and that sort of thing, tied to diseases that are also somehow tied to minorities, right?
Yeah.
um so yeah, I think there's just a lot of consideration to make because it is so pressing. Like, you know, it's the typical thing that people say is comedy plus like, what is it? Pain plus time equals comedy, you know? Like that's the typical thing people say.
Yeah.
Timing is so important in comedy and allowing people to laugh.
Yeah.
And so we just have to really be mindful of that, I think.
And so with that, it must make it extremely hard because here it is, you've got I mean, it's a very political time. We've got this like being politically correct is something that's very difficult for comedians especially,
Mhm.
and for everyone. So we're not even sure what we're allowed to laugh at or not laugh at, or like, is it okay to bring light to a topic, to even talk about it? And I think what you're trying to do and what you have done is so brave because of so many reasons, but not the least of which, you're taking several difficult things at one time and you're approaching them with comedy. But I also think that it's by adding the science and by addressing these tough issues and giving people a chance to laugh, giving people a chance to have that release, that there's almost something therapeutic in it. And
Mhm.
so to that end, what have you seen as far as, how people have responded, or what you've been hearing back from people, once, they went to the show, they were showing support. You said some people left and they were angry. How do you feel about that now that you've done it? Is there anything you'd be doing differently? That's another question.
um I don't think there's anything we could have done better at the time,
Yeah,
especially because the news kept changing every single hour.
all the
You know,
time.
like
Yeah.
the time that March 1st, the night that we had our show, was the same night the announcement of the first like COVID-19 coronavirus patient in New York City was. Like that was the first confirmation. And so like, you know, coming out of the show and being like, okay, we're able to laugh. Like had I known that was like had we had that news come out like even before, that would have changed
Yeah.
like the how we would frame the show, right? How we
Yeah.
would frame the experience. um I think maybe the one thing that I would have changed would have been, I didn't expect there to be a couple of elderly folks in the audience. That's like a
Yeah.
very unusual thing for a comedy show, especially the kinds of shows that we do in that particular venue. That's like a very different demographic from what we're used to. And so, you know, not all the comedians needed to like address that, but I think I would have personally had like a few more jokes in my pocket tied to ageism, like tied
Yeah.
to like really confronting ageism, because that's another layer. But that's not the responsibility of all the performers. Like the reason why we bring so many different performers and styles of comedy, like it's a variety show for a reason,
Yeah.
was I allowed us to then be able to tap into different like messages and different ideas, without the burden of having to do everything ourselves, you know.
Mhm.
I think that's the only real difference because of the context of creating the show, and then like what it led up to marketing it, and then what it meant for people leaving. Interesting thing though, like I mean, Esther, my co-producer, is
Yeah.
not like she herself says that she's not, you know, scientifically literate necessarily, or like she isn't the kind of person who seeks that sort of stuff out. And so it was really fun to like see her combat misinformation or like really, passionately say back things that she picked up from the show and from the science part.
Yeah. Yeah.
The same with our other comedians. Like, you don't typically encounter science in the same space as like a regular stand-up comedy night. It's very atypical. And so it was really great to see them kind of also share that to be like, oh yeah, just like what Kyle said, the face masks, like you're not using it right, like, oh, like really repeating the correct information to their network in a way that is the purpose of like why we're able to laugh and learn, like why it's so powerful to me to be able to make people laugh and learn. And the final thing that I think has struck me and I find really powerful in creating these kinds of spaces that are like more on the intersectional side, but like admittedly on the educational comedy end of things, um, is that I've had fellow Asian comedians who are on the show say thank you for creating the space, but also how it empowered them to like, not not just sit and take in other comedians who make, lazy racist jokes, right?
Yeah. Yeah.
Like there's an empowerment to that of like being able to show each other that like, yeah, we can say something and also point that out. Like we have that skill.
Yeah.
We can fight back against our own inclinations of being a model minority of like, we can say stuff and enact change in that way. So it's
Yeah.
been really, really interesting to see the social impact after the show from that.
Your timing couldn't have been
It
more
couldn't have been better.
perfect. I mean, I remember when I saw, and I was just, trying to go through and, you know, figure out what was going on and tracking hashtags and content.
Yeah.
And I saw this and I thought it was so unique. It was so timely and perfect for exactly what was going on. And even just seeing a creative effort, a creative endeavor that was also smart, that was right there and ready, was a relief because, not to get too deep or woo, but like, um, when you see what humans are capable of being creative and being intelligent and being able, I mean, it was such a light because it was like, wow, this is so smart and great. And I love that this is happening. I don't even know anything else about it, but I love that this is happening. And it made me reach out to you to say, oh my God, I need to share this. Right now in the association community, there's, oh God, it's just, every association has annual meetings. And a lot of people don't think about it this way, but like the MBA is an association. So it's like, in the world of associations, this is huge because every time there's a large conference that's not happening, or that is happening and then people get infected,
Mm,
it's awful. So like Biogen was part of, it was a conference, right? And it
right.
was being put on by an association. So all of these association and event professionals that follow what association chat does, there's this conversation about, should we go ahead and have these meetings, should we not have these meetings?
Mhm.
And one of the interesting things I thought is, you had an in-person meeting, you were bringing, and it was bringing people together to like watch the show. Did you think at some point like, oh wow, they're saying social distancing and stuff and we're having a show and everybody's together? Like,
I mean, I said it at the beginning of the show.
oh
Like,
really? Yeah.
that was our opener. Like, that was how I opened it. It was like, how's everyone feeling? I know we're feeling anxious. I'm particularly feeling anxious, not because of the coronavirus. And then Esther is like, yeah, because you brought in all these people together when there's like panic happening, right? Um,
Right.
as a scientifically informed person, I knew that the risk was lower. It's all
Yeah.
probability, right? And
Right.
taking the right steps and measures. But like at least I knew that like the confirmed case came from Westchester, from
Yeah.
like, and like the situation of like how a scientist would actually go about trying to figure out and calculate risk is part of that is having a chain, like understanding the chain reaction, right? And like understanding
Yes,
like
yes.
where people are coming from, how does this stuff transmit, right? And so being just mindful of that, and that's why, up top we address that because that was a huge part of it. um but then also throughout the show reminding people that what's going to keep you safe is the thing that keeps you safe when you've got the flu and the cold, and it's like keeping your fluids to yourself, right?
Yeah.
Like keeping like, and so embedding that message in not necessarily an upfront here's a list what you must do way, but like
Right.
that was really important. But I mean, it was also hammering in how much more impactful individual choice is than letting your fear take over. So, like, I mean, you're experiencing this. South by Southwest has just canceled. Like, that was the biggest one. And the reactions to that were mixed, a mix of like, really? Isn't it like, isn't that overkill? And a lot of other meetings, like
Yeah.
professional meetings, are also canceling. And to be able to also talk to other people about how like, well, it does look like overkill for you, but it's actually a socially responsible thing for them to do, because then we're lessening the risk of overloading an already overloaded healthcare system, right?
Yeah.
Like, and
Yeah.
so these are things that like i- now the New York City events community, comedy spaces have to start to be mindful, and they do have to plan. As a producer of shows, I have to really have these difficult conversations with venues that I love who I don't want to close, right?
Right.
Like it is a difficult conversation to have, especially because it's tied to um in New York City, a venue staying open to be able to keep doing their business, right?
Right. I mean, this is people's livelihoods. And so there's a lot of pushback. I get paid to speak. And so I feel it if something doesn't happen, but probably, I mean, not even probably, definitely not to the extent that somebody who runs an AV company does, where that's their entire business is supplying AV and having people there, and they can't afford to keep people on, or they can't afford to, they were planning and spending money like they were going to be there, or they're actually at the event and it
Right.
gets canceled.
Right.
It's like,
Yeah.
what now,
It's also interesting because I'm still connected to like the graduate student communities, and it's interesting to see them, really spotlight how predatory some of the reimbursement, um, like how academia's reimbursement platform for, like you have to put in your money first to go to these big conferences that have a big impact
Yes.
on your career, and then you have to sit and wait for, like, you have to take that debt and then wait for the reimbursement afterwards, and how that's really seriously being like talked about now as a problem, like
Yeah.
these are social issues that like this COVID-19 is highlighting, that we can solve and we can change, but why did it have to take this to really enact change? Like there's all these like social repercussions.
That's such an interesting point. I hadn't really thought about the fact that with the reimbursement stuff, I used to work for the Optical Society of America, and it was the same thing when there were student chapter leaders that were coming over. They would get their reimbursements later, but sometimes they'd have to wait for like months,
Yeah.
depending on how long the paperwork, was there. And I remember one time, and they're totally stranded once they get over if anything goes wrong. And so I remember one time a person didn't have, it just was running, and this is normal stuff. This is not considering what's going on with coronavirus,
Mm-hmm.
but was ended up totally stranded with no money, like just ended up over here and was trying to exist, literally just based off of the meals that were provided and stuff, and ended up in a situation where she didn't have any money, and it was scary. But that's how limited things are, totally predatory when people are having to wait for so long. So it probably will lead to change, hopefully, after
Yeah.
this.
Yeah. And also, Speaking of like associations and meetings, right? Like meetings and conferences are a huge part of just the business model of
Mhm.
associations in general. Um, but like the social distancing choices that people are making are now also spotlighting, you know, people with disabilities have had to deal with this for a long time and have had pushback on making conferences more accessible. And it's taking now for people to be like, oh, let's figure out a digital technological solution.
Right.
And it's like,
Right.
well, there are disabilities communities who've been advocating for this and you haven't listened to them. And now you're asking other people instead of going directly to the people who've, been looking for solutions for this for so long. So yeah, it's been really eye-opening for me, to also see just all the different ways this particular emerging disease is spotlighting issues, social issues in the way the world works in the US especially, you know?
Yeah, you are brilliant. I love you so much.
Thank
Like,
you.
I think you're so great. Yeah, I mean, that's such a good point because there are people in our industry who have been saying for such a long time, like, we need to do better. And now this is happening. And anyone who's not prepared for it, it's not like we don't have the technology. It's
Right,
not like we don't have the ability to do this. We just haven't made it a priority. And those who have made it a priority and can switch pretty easily to virtual, solutions are going to have an easier time of it as a result of that.
right, right.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's hard to have these conversations when the social, like the currency for making change is money, right? Like,
Yeah.
because then it's not until you're really hurting financially when people are like, oh, we should have done that,
Yeah.
right?
Yeah.
Instead of being more proactive and just like in general being able to enact change sooner. Yeah, no, there's a lot of stuff that's just bubbling up just now, and I feel like, yeah, these are all conversations that could be touched on, through humor, but I don't know, timing is everything. Timing is
Yeah.
a huge thing.
So what do you think is going to happen next? I mean, not with the virus, but I mean for you, and I guess depending on what happens with the virus, because it's going to dictate things like, can you do the shows, and also, I'm sure this is bringing ideas to the forefront of other collaborations and other projects. So what are you thinking?
Um, so it's funny because I like, since I've been doing sort of educational academic science comedy for a while now. I started, my first time was in 2015, like really kind of finding comedy for myself even. But for the past 2.5 years, a lot of the shows that I have personally produced have been tied to figuring out what it means to use comedy to educate people like adults who have the power and finances to actually enact any kind of change, but to also really tap into what, you know experts look and sound like to really question and critique what academia like is, and why the knowledge that we take for granted is the way that it is, but is not inclusive of all the people who are in humanity in general.
Yeah.
um like I created the Symposium academic stand up specifically for that. Like that was my mission with it, was to figure out, okay, if I did a show that was just celebrating Black History Month, what should that look like, right? And it was, yeah, Black academics talking about both the what they do in their research, but also why it's so hard emotionally, spiritually, like to be a minority, and especially a Black person in academia, right? Like what were the things that they had to fight for, or like doing a show that is specifically titled, F word, like sex and gender norms, and like really spotlighting how those kinds of norms, the binary, like people not caring about, people caring too much about them being a plural, like why that's harmful to everybody and not just like trans folks or non-binary folks.
Yeah.
um And like these are things that I've been doing for the past 2.5 years that I felt like really set me up to mindfully create and produce Asian Strike Back, a coronavirus comedy and science show. Like these
Yeah.
are things that I've been working on in many ways, but because they're, they might not be marketed the right way, or like I didn't use the correct minority keyword, they wouldn't necessarily be as like well attended or that sort of thing. But like it's
Yeah.
like all of that trial and error and like successes have led up to this moment of me being able to like really tie it in. Like last year, a couple of my last shows were, one was museums are not neutral, the hashtag, which spotlighted how museums are racist spaces and continue to perpetuate that sort of thing. And sure, change is happening, but like it's not happening fast enough. And so, how do I include indigenous voices to like talk to, like, to make comedy
Yeah.
in front of curators who are the ones who are hiring people? Like, what does it mean to make
Yes.
that space? What does it mean to make a comedy show specifically about why race science is coming back, eugenics is coming back, and that, like,
Is it
science,
really?
it
God,
is. It's
that
just, it's
is crazy.
awful. It's awful. And it comes from people who have PhDs, like,
But that's
and
the thing I'm wondering. I mean, with like with the coronavirus, you're definitely seeing where, there I started creating this list that was like reliable,
hmm,
uh,
sources.
yeah,
Yeah.
yeah, reliable scientists to follow on this subject and on Twitter. And so I was, created this list, but there are crackpot, I mean, real crackpots that are not helping, who are saying awful things
Mhm.
that are perpetuating rumors or are really towing political lines in order in one direction or another to like either bring people to hysteria or make people angry.
Mhm.
And that PhD is like this trust cue that people just look at it and they imagine, okay, they must know everything they need to know. If I were an epidemiologist of high standing right now,
Yeah.
I would need a comedy show for me because I would be so frustrated. Like, oh my God, please tell me about epidemiology, you person who has never ever studied this ever. I've only spent my entire career doing this, you know.
Yeah. No, it, it's interesting because, like, in theory, having that degree should make you the go-to person.
Yeah.
But where that becomes a faulty thing is human behavior, right? Like the human condition. And so it's hard because, like, I want people to trust experts. Like, that's, they've spent their whole times doing that. But if those experts aren't like interdisciplinary, they also have, and or they don't have intersectionally important lived experiences to talk about certain things, whether or not, like, why some emerging diseases are racist, like, that plays a role in how things are contextualized. I think one of the things that I remember really responding to, and one of the reasons why I wanted an all Asian show including the scientists, was because the early stages of the reporting on the new coronavirus
Mhm.
was largely like, here are the facts, here is what's happening, this is the location, this is the stuff. But all of those things kept reiterating, China, China, Wuhan, China, Asia, Asia, right? Like,
Yeah.
and then it builds on existing experiences of people who are like already have a bias against, right, these folks,
Right.
or like and that's why it was so easy to to unseed all of these old anti-Asian sentiments tied to food culture, tied to hygiene, etc., right?
Right.
Like they're all tied together, and it's largely because, like, when you're reporting, you're not also reporting on, and remember, guys, right? Like a lot of these fear and hysteria is what led to internment camps for Chinese and Japanese folks in,
Yeah.
in the US. Like this is, it's not something that we typically talk about, and like the journalistic standards is that you're only reporting the facts, but sometimes it's harmful, right?
Yeah.
And like, and it's socially responsible to address that, but it takes people who have had that opportunity to also like really dig into that.